Lysosome dysfunction is a big contributor in aging, particularly in long-lived cells like the heart and brain. The lysosome is an organelle inside of a cell, and it functions very much like the stomach. Its responsibility is to break down miscellaneous materials. Anything that needs to be broken down or recycled, it's sent to the lysosome. Remember when we were talking earlier about the mitochondria. When the mitochondria becomes dysfunctional, it's tagged and sent to the lysosome, broken down into usable parts, and then it uses those for whatever the cell has to do. These problems stem from undegradable material that the lysosome has to deal with, and this is called lipofuscin. This is an undegradable material that builds up inside of lysosomes that it does not have the enzymes to break down. A lysosome, as I said, is much like a stomach. It's an organelle that's filled with acid, highly concentrated acid, and various enzymes, which basically function like a Swiss Army knife, where each enzyme is used to break a particular bond. Well, for this stuff called lipofuscin, it's basically just a catch-all term for stuff that cannot be broken down by the lysosome. It doesn't have the proper enzymes to get rid of this stuff, so it accumulates inside of the lysosome, and this is a problem because the lysosome is so important for the rest of the cell. If the lysosome is not working, it will not be able to break down this molecular trash inside of the cell, and it won't be able to get new parts to use in the rest of the cell's mechanics that it needs. It's bricks and mortar, so to say. And this contributes to that by taking up more and more space inside of the lysosome. It can't get rid of it, it cannot export it out of the cell, it just stays inside of the lysosome. It takes up more and more room, and as a result, a few things happen. First, and most importantly, the concentration of acid over time becomes reduced, and as a result, the lysosome is less able to do its job, and it enters a vicious cycle, very much the way people think that free radicals are a vicious cycle in aging. Well, this is a true vicious cycle, in the sense that it does actually take place, where in the other one it was proven, in the old free radical theory of aging, it was proven to not be a vicious cycle. So what happens here is that the concentration of acid is reduced, and as a result, it takes longer for things to be processed, or in a worst case scenario, since these enzymes, they only work in high acid environments. If the pH changes, then they no longer work or don't work as well. So as they become less able to function properly, stuff gets backed up in the lysosome. Imagine, to use the example of a stomach again, imagine the concentration of acid in someone's stomach is just decreased by half, say. They're still able to digest some food, but it takes a lot longer. And then as someone keeps adding more and more food into it, it takes longer and longer and longer to digest, and then it backs up, and then they just blow up, basically. And that is a problem with atherosclerosis, which we'll talk a little bit about later. But that is essentially what's happening. It's taking up more and more space inside the lysosome. It's causing it to have trouble keeping up with its workload, and also over time it can end up taking up significant space inside of the cell. As we can see here over on the top, here is a brain cell, and you can see this reddish stuff. That is lipofuscin, and it takes up a significant portion of the cell. Here is a heart cell, and again we can see that lipofuscin is taking up a significant portion of the cell, which interferes with, again, the functionality of the lysosome, but also just with intracellular traffic. If it takes up more space, obviously that causes problems. And this is a problem, as I mentioned earlier, in long-lived cells, because they do not divide. In other cells, like skin cells, they divide. So every time they divide, they take half of that junk with them, and as a result, it never builds up into something that is going to seriously affect the health of the cell. But in heart and brain cells, they never divide. So what you have at a certain age, that is what you've got for the rest of your life. And they continue to build the stuff their whole life. Heart cells, brain cells, eye cells. These are places that are very susceptible to this kind of thing. So we learned what happens inside of the lysosome, and again, that causes problems inside of the lysosome itself, but also what I want to explain in this next example is that it can cause problems outside of the cell. Lipofuscin is something that builds up inside of the lysosome itself. But in many other disease states like Alzheimer's, Huntington's disease, Parkinson's, these are diseases where things build up not in the lysosome, but inside of the cell. This diagram right here is of 3 brains. The left is a normal brain, and then continuing over to the right we have brains with more what are called neurofiber tangles, essentially, and the brown stuff is this plaque as a result of it, and it's basically garbage that's building up in the brain. What I want to show are a couple of studies. Here is just the general garbage catastrophe theory of aging, or it's called the mitochondrial lysosome axis theory of aging. It basically explains what I just explained, how lipofuscin builds up inside of lysosomes, and it causes a dysfunction in the lysosome, and as a result, there are problems associated with that dysfunction within the lysosome and then outside of the lysosome. But this is the one I really want to show. Tau fragmentation, aggregation, and clearance, the dual role of lysosome in processing. Tau protein is what people are really looking at in various disease states like Alzheimer's, Parkinson's, Huntington's disease. It's basically these tangles, these fibers that start tangling up inside of cells in the brain, and they end up causing all kinds of dysfunction. As we can see, it's just garbage, that intracellular garbage that builds up. And for a long time, people were looking at various things, but now people are looking more towards the lysosome's role in all of this, and that's what this study is. And basically, what they did in this study is they just deactivated the autophagy capabilities of the lysosome. The autophagy basically is just where it just surrounds garbage and swallows it whole, basically. They took away that capability from the lysosome, and they had a look at what the result was. I think it was around here I read. Yeah, so treatment with 3-MA did not inhibit the generation of F2, F3, contrary to increased level of all tau fragments, 80 to 60% increase. So people were looking a long time ago, and they noticed that the lysosome. There's some pictures. Let me see if I can find one. Because in the past, people thought actually the lysosome was causing some of these aggregations, and it is to some extent, because it's unable to. Oh, I thought there was a picture here somewhere. Ah, here we go. See, there are these particular types of fragments that try to get into the lysosome. It cannot break down, so it breaks it down into different kinds of pieces, and these pieces are susceptible to aggregation where they clump together. So people were, when they did this experiment, they thought that deactivating the lysosome might slow this, but what they saw is that it actually increased it, because what they found was later on, when these things build up, the lysosome comes and then uses that autophagy and just swallows this whole thing whole. So as time goes on, people are hypothesizing that just the general dysfunction of the lysosome causes it not to be able to handle its regular workload, and as other things become dysfunctional in the cell, in the brain cell, there are other mechanisms by which it gets rid of junk, and sometimes it's these things that stop working. And as a result, since those things stop working, the body sends the rest of it to the lysosome, so the lysosome gets overloaded. So that's another way which lysosome dysfunction has a role in aging. Besides from the obvious lipofuscin building up within inside of itself, there are other things that build up outside of the cell because there's nothing degrading it, or it's degrading the stuff too slowly because the acid concentration is too low and the enzymes are not working as well, or not working at all. And we'll do one more example. So here's a basic diagram of what's going on in atherosclerosis, which is that plaque that builds up in people's arteries. Remember low density lipoprotein when we were talking about how mitochondria are able to spread oxidative stress outside of the body while there's still being relatively few of those mutated mitochondria. Here's one thing that oxidized low density lipoprotein does. This is the major cause of atherosclerosis. Oxidized low density lipoprotein, it has a tendency to stick to things, and one of the things it sticks to is the blood vessel walls. And when it does, the blood vessels, they release cytokines. That's what all this stuff is. And this diagram, don't really worry about this. This is just, it shows exactly how the immune response takes place. But we don't really care about that. Basically what happens is that it summons macrophages. Macrophages are basically an immune cell that just, it's kind of like the lysosome where it just envelops it and just swallows it whole and eats and gets rid of it. The trouble with the macrophages is they cannot process this oxidized low density lipoprotein. I remember there was a study a while ago, probably should have looked it up, but it was like 7 keto cholesterol or something like that. I can't remember what exactly it was, but there's in particular a particular type of oxidized cholesterol that the macrophage cannot get rid of. It's the same problem, cannot process this, so eventually it keeps eating all of this stuff, and eventually it turns into this foam cell and it just blows up. And then it releases all of this stuff all over again. And then the blood vessel walls, they release more cytokines, and cytokines are things that attract the immune system's attention, basically. So you get even more macrophages and more of an inflammatory response, and it just keeps building and building and building until you've got this plaque that clogs someone's artery. But again, it's a simple problem of having a material that cannot be degraded by the lysosome. Just can't get rid of it, so it just keeps building. And this is an unfortunate side effect, that we have this immune response. It wouldn't be so bad if you didn't have this immune response, and then the macrophage eats it all, gathers it all into like a little clump, and then it dies because it can't get rid of it. And then it ends up blowing up, and then you've got even a bigger problem. So it's a problem that feeds on itself. And one question is to why does this even happen? We have to think about it evolutionarily. You have to remember that people are basically designed for living in the jungle, and when they were living in the jungle, they only generally lived to be 20, 30 years old if they managed to survive childhood. So a lot of these things, they take a long time, like lipofuscin, it takes a long time for it to build up to a significant level to where it's going to cause damage. 20, 30 years, it's not really a big deal. And even people who eat really unhealthily, atherosclerosis, it takes them until 40, 50 for them to have a serious problem. So that's what you have to remember, is the body is designed only to last its useful life. People were not living to be very long when they were living in the jungle. That's what they were evolved to do, to live in this environment, and they were getting eaten or killed by something or dying of some disease in their 20s or 30s. So that's how long it's designed to last. Think of it like the way you would pack to go on vacation. If you're going for 7 days, how long do you pack for? 7 days. You don't pack for a month. It's a waste. And that's the way evolution treats all of these things. It only solves the problems that are going to occur during its useful life. So hopefully this gives a general explanation on how lysosome dysfunction can cause various pathologies associated with different age-related illnesses and just general aging itself.